At 8:37 a.m. on October 12, 1980, a Verona, Kentucky housewife named Helen Marlene Oakes was reported missing, not by her husband, not by her neighbors, but by silence. Her purse remained on the kitchen table. Her shoes were beside the door. Her car sat in the driveway with a quarter tank of gas. The only thing missing was Marlene, and no one would see her alive again. The Oakes residence stood at the edge of a narrow road in Boone County, a modest, two-story frame house backed by fields and bordered by a short tree line. Marlene Oakes, 25, lived there with her husband William Major and their two children, Donald, 6, and Lalana, 4. The home showed no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass. But by the morning of October 12, 1980, Marlene was gone. Neighbors would later recall that the house had been quiet that night. Too quiet. No sounds of a struggle, no shouting, no slamming doors. Yet sometime between 10 p.m. and dawn, Marlene disappeared without alerting a single soul. Investigators from the Boone County Sheriff's Office initially treated the incident as a routine missing person case. Patrol officers logged the scene. No blood, no immediate indicators of foul play. There were no fingerprints in unusual locations, no signs of a break-in. Marlene's car keys were still on the counter, and her vehicle had not been moved. Her identification, wallet, and cosmetics remained untouched. At that time, no one in law enforcement saw a reason to elevate the case. A young mother had apparently walked away from her life in the middle of the night, barefoot, leaving two children behind. No one questioned the implausibility. The husband, William Major, 28, told officers that Marlene had been acting distant in the weeks prior. He claimed she left voluntarily, possibly with a new boyfriend. When pressed for details, where she might have gone, who she might be with, he couldn't provide any names, addresses, or calls she might have made. She said she was done, William said flatly. She walked out. There were no witnesses to confirm that statement. No friend had seen or spoken to Marlene in the days before. She hadn't shown up for work at the local diner where she waited tables part-time. She hadn't called her sister. She hadn't dropped the kids off with anyone. Her disappearance was total. Then came the first irregularity. Deputies learned that William had dropped both children off with his parents in the early morning hours of October 12th. According to his father, William showed up unannounced, saying that Marlene had taken off and he needed time to get his head straight. He returned home later that afternoon. The children remained with their grandparents for the next 2 weeks. A timeline began to form, but it didn't make sense. Why would a woman leave without her children, without money, without her car? And why would her husband immediately remove the kids from the scene if he believed she'd simply left? Detectives interviewed neighbors on both sides of the Oakes property. One neighbor recalled hearing a loud thud, like furniture being overturned, around midnight on October 11th. She didn't investigate at the time. Another neighbor mentioned seeing William's pickup truck leave the driveway around 2 o'clock a.m., an unusual hour for a family man to be out driving. The Boone County Sheriff's Office filed a preliminary report, then shelved the case. With no body and no evidence of a crime, Marlene was treated as a missing adult. No search warrant was issued for the home, no forensic sweep, no luminol tests. The husband wasn't brought in for further questioning. The file sat untouched for months, but Marlene hadn't simply vanished. On February 4th, 1981, 116 days after Marlene Oakes was reported missing, Glenn St. Hilaire entered the Boone County Sheriff's Office carrying a sealed manila envelope. She requested to speak directly with the detective. When none was immediately available, she handed the envelope to a clerk and requested it be added to the case file for Marlene Oakes, missing since October. No questions were asked. No report number was added at that moment. Inside the envelope were 16 handwritten pages. Each one had been drafted by Marlene herself in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Glenn explained in a written cover note that Marlene had asked her to keep these notes safe, in case something happened. The entries were not organized chronologically but were numbered. They read more like documentation than personal writing, observations, dates, and descriptions of conversations inside the home. The most serious allegation appeared on page 13, where Marlene expressed concern that her husband might be harming their son. She did not describe specific incidents but noted behavioral changes, unusual bruising, and the child's reluctance to speak when alone. Marlene wrote that she intended to contact a lawyer. She referred to a planned meeting scheduled for October 13, 1980. The entry was clear. "I've kept quiet for too long. I need to get out. I need the kids safe. I'm afraid of what will happen if I move too fast. This material was not acted on. According to archived call logs, the case detective was notified of the submission but made no formal request to interview Glenn or examine the content in detail. The journal pages were stored in a secondary file drawer labeled Supplemental Reports. No chain of custody was established. The pages were not forensically analyzed, nor were they copied for distribution to the prosecuting attorney or social services. At the time, Boone County had no specialized domestic violence unit. Reports involving household disputes were often downgraded if there was no physical injury on record. Without a body, a witness, or a police report confirming immediate danger, the case remained classified as missing adult status unverified. No judge was petitioned to authorize a search of the home. No follow-up occurred with the attorney's office listed in Marlene's notes. The journal sat in storage for 20 years. Meanwhile, Glenn began making calls to attorneys on her own. She contacted 3 legal offices in Boone and Kenton counties asking if anyone had scheduled appointments under the name Marlene Oaks in early October 1980. One paralegal at James DeHaven and Associates confirmed that a woman by that name had requested a consultation regarding separation and potential custody. The appointment was scheduled for October 13th. She never showed up. No one followed up. In March 1981, Glenn gave a second written statement to a reporter from the Cincinnati Enquirer who was compiling a brief on unresolved missing persons cases. The article ran in the Metro section under the headline, "Still Missing, Still Waiting." Glenn's contribution was one sentence. She was scared. She was preparing to leave. Someone should have asked why she didn't. The case remained inactive. Patrol logs noted periodic drive-bys of the Oaks residence, but there was no further field activity logged by detectives. No forensic sweep, no subpoenas. The original missing person report was never amended to reflect the submission of new material. During a routine review in April 1981, the Boone County Clerk's Office noted that Marlene's driver's license had not been renewed and that no official mail had been forwarded to any new address. Her bank account showed no withdrawals. There were no attempts to contact her children. The data reinforced what Glenn already understood. Marlene had not left on her own, but no warrant had been signed, and no one had looked for a body. On the morning of November 29, 1981, 2 licensed hunters entered a wooded section off Hathaway Ridge near Verona, Boone County, for seasonal whitetail tracking. At approximately 9:20 a.m., one of them spotted what he first believed to be an animal bone partially exposed along a sloped embankment. Upon closer inspection, it became clear the object was a human skull, partially unearthed, absent its jaw, and situated beneath shallow erosion layers. Boone County Sheriff's Office dispatched a patrol unit and a field investigator by 10:07 a.m. The site was cordoned off. Initial visual documentation noted no clothing, footwear, or other remains visible at ground level. Soil in the area was loose and saturated, consistent with seasonal runoff. The skull had likely been disturbed by water movement after heavy rains earlier that fall. The remains were transferred to the Kenton County Coroner's Office. The preliminary report confirmed the object was a human cranium, likely adult, with sex undetermined but consistent with female morphology. No visible fracture lines or projectile indicators were noted. Dental analysis was not possible. All teeth were absent, likely due to post-mortem degradation rather than extraction. The mandible was never located. The location of discovery, 2.8 miles from the Oaks property, was recorded but not flagged as significant in the incident report. The skull was labeled as Jane Doe, November 29, 81, and entered into evidence. No cross-reference was initiated with active or unresolved missing person cases in the county. An area search was conducted over the next 48 hours using manual gridding and light excavation tools. Investigators recovered no additional bones, no clothing fabric, no jewelry or personal effects. The soil composition and rainfall exposure suggested the remains had been buried shallowly, possibly wrapped or covered in soft organic material that had since decomposed. No tool marks were present in the surrounding terrain. Photographs showed slight impressions along the ridge, but nothing conclusive. At that time, Boone County lacked digital indexing for missing person records. Each report existed on individual carbon-backed forms. The skull's demographic profile, female, mid-20s, small frame, was consistent with more than one entry in regional archives. No central analysis system existed to flag overlapping characteristics. Without teeth, fingerprints, or DNA protocol in place, the file remained inactive. A medical examiner's note from December 3rd stated, skull consistent with estimated post-mortem interval of 12-18 months. Evidence suggests initial burial followed by gradual exposure. Cause of death cannot be determined. Recommend retention for future identification. The document was archived with the remains. No facial reconstruction was attempted. No bulletin was issued beyond a single paragraph in the Boone County Recorder, published under minor incidents. Hunters discover partial human remains off Rural Ridge. Authorities report no foul play suspected. The detective assigned to the field response later logged that the case required no further action unless new information develops. At no point was the record reconciled with the missing person file of Helen Marlene Oakes, still listed as voluntary departure, not endangered. The failure was not solely technological, it was procedural. No investigative task force reviewed unresolved disappearances. No analyst was assigned to pattern-match skeletal recoveries. Jane Doe, November 29, 81, remained listed as unidentified female, rural exposure, and the skull was placed in long-term forensic storage under climate control. The remains would sit undisturbed for 20 years. The ridge where the skull was found remained undeveloped. The nearest private land, registered to the Major family, was located within walking distance, but no warrant was ever issued to search it. The detail was logged in the case map overlay, but never followed up. As the winter of 1981 closed, Boone County had logged a potential homicide scene without pursuing the possibility, without blood, without an active lead, without a name. In September 1985, the Kentucky Cabinet for Health and Family Services opened a case file involving two minors, Donald and Lalana Major, after a mandated reporter flagged signs of abuse at their elementary school in Walton. Donald, now 11, had disclosed to a guidance counselor that home was not safe, and later during a structured forensic interview, he made specific allegations of sexual abuse. Within 72 hours, both children were placed into protective custody. A secondary forensic interview with Lalana corroborated the details, including names, locations, and a general timeline of events. CPS activated joint protocols with local law enforcement. The children's accounts contained consistent references to coercion, physical intimidation, and threats of disappearance if they spoke. On October 3rd, William Major was arrested on 2 counts of sexual abuse in the first degree. At the time, he was living alone in a rented house in northern Boone County. A warrant was executed to search the residence. Investigators recovered bedding, multiple containers of undeveloped film, and 3 handwritten letters. The film was undeveloped and later revealed no relevant content. The letters, unrelated to the children, were admitted into evidence as supporting character material. The prosecution filed a motion to introduce prior conviction history. Court documents confirmed that in 1975, William had pled guilty to molesting 2 minors unrelated to his family. That conviction resulted in a suspended sentence and court-ordered therapy. The judge allowed the prior offenses to be referenced in sentencing, not during trial. The criminal trial in 1986 lasted 4 days. Both children testified via closed-circuit television from a secure location. They answered structured, limited questions to reduce re-traumatization. Their responses were consistent and clear. The court-appointed pediatric psychologist confirmed signs of long-term trauma and manipulation. The defense presented no counter-witnesses and declined to put William Major on the stand. He was convicted on both counts and sentenced to 20 years in state custody. The sentencing transcript recorded the judge's statement. This court acknowledges that the defendant has demonstrated a pattern of predatory behavior extending over a decade and across multiple victims. The damage done to his own children is irreversible. During post-conviction intake, William refused all voluntary rehabilitation programs. His parole eligibility was set at 85% of the term. He began serving his sentence at Green River Correctional Complex. No formal reevaluation of Marlene Oakes' disappearance occurred at this stage, despite multiple overlapping markers: household history of abuse, prior criminal conviction, and the children's timeline referencing when mom went away. Investigators did not cross-verify dates with the missing person file or the recovered skull labeled Jane Doe, November 29, 81. However, one data point entered the record. Lalana stated during a trauma session, "He said she left, but I knew she didn't." The comment was noted but not escalated. Donald exited the foster care system in 1992 at age 18. No further contact was recorded. His case file was closed. Lalana remained in therapeutic care through age 16. She later petitioned for access to her juvenile file and requested a certified copy of her mother's missing person report in 1997. She was denied, as the case was still listed as unresolved with no foul play indicated. By the year 2000, she had made 6 separate public records requests under her full legal name. One of them included a formal inquiry into whether Boone County held any unidentified female remains recovered in the early 1980s. That request went unanswered due to staff turnover and incomplete digitization. What remained consistent, though never acted on, was the proximity of fact: a convicted abuser with known victims, a missing woman with a pending family court action, and a skull buried 3 miles from the last known address. The system had pieces. It just never moved them into place. In February 2001, Lalana Major submitted an official notarized request to the Kentucky State Police Forensic Identification Unit. The request included a buccal swab collected by a licensed medical provider, a signed consent form for mitochondrial DNA analysis, and a reference to case file Jane Doe, November 29, 81. Attached was a brief personal statement citing her mother, Helen Marlene Oakes, as missing since October 1980. This was the first time anyone had connected the unidentified skull recovered in Boone County in 1981 to Marlene's case through procedural channels. Prior to that, the 2 files, one missing person, one unidentified remains, had existed on separate paths with no shared indexing. The sample was received and processed by an external laboratory under contract with the state. At the time, Kentucky's in-house lab did not perform maternal DNA matching. The specimen was shipped to a certified facility in North Carolina. Chain of custody documentation was verified at every stage. On April 10, 2001, results were returned with a 99.98% probability of a direct maternal match. Jane Doe, November 29, 81, was formally identified as Helen Marlene Oakes. Boone County Sheriff's Office was notified on April 12th. The original missing person case was reclassified as a homicide pending further inquiry. The cold case file, dormant for over a decade, was reopened under new administrative ID. Case materials, journal pages, witness statements, interview notes, were consolidated and transferred to the Criminal Investigations Division. One of the first actions was a property audit. Investigators verified that the location where the skull had been found sat within 2 miles of property owned by the Major family during the early 1980s. No prior search had ever been conducted. That omission was noted in the report. A re-examination of the remains followed. The skull was still intact and in storage at the State Medical Examiner's facility. A forensic anthropologist conducted a second analysis focusing on wear patterns and soil residue. The results were consistent with earlier findings: shallow burial, long-term exposure, no trauma evident. However, new microanalysis revealed traces of dyed polyester fibers inside the cranial cavity. The fibers matched those found in common women's apparel from the late 1970s. A plastic zipper fragment, retained during the original retrieval but not cataloged, was also re-evaluated. These findings supported the theory that the victim had been buried clothed, possibly wrapped. Simultaneously, law enforcement approached James Major Sr., father of William Major. He had been estranged from his son for nearly 2 decades, but remained cooperative with investigators. Detectives arranged a monitored call with William, still incarcerated at Green River Correctional Complex for prior convictions. During the conversation, which lasted just under 9 minutes, William made several statements that were flagged for content relevance. When asked if he regretted how things happened with Marlene, he replied, "I handled it. It was messy, but it's done." The audio was recorded under court-sanctioned conditions. Investigators submitted the transcript with supporting affidavits. This recording, paired with the identification of the remains and the recovered journal, created the prosecutorial basis for a first-degree murder charge. Lalana was formally notified of the identification on May 2, 2001. She declined a press conference but provided a single written statement to the county clerk's office. "Thank you for confirming what I already knew." She declined to claim the remains for burial. Instead, she signed a document authorizing the coroner's office to retain the skull as forensic evidence until legal proceedings were concluded. The prosecutor's office filed for indictment in early June. The cumulative evidence, DNA confirmation, forensic consistency, recorded admission, corroborating statements, met the minimum threshold for a grand jury referral. The case was no longer cold. On June 12, 2001, Boone County prosecutors received a copy of the recorded prison call between William Major and his father. The audio file, labeled Exhibit A006, ran just under 9 minutes. It had been reviewed in real time by 2 detectives and a senior attorney before being transcribed for evidentiary submission. Key statements from the call were flagged. The language was indirect but suggestive. Phrases like, "I handled it," and "that's the part I don't regret," were isolated and logged. While not an explicit confession, the statements indicated knowledge, control, and a lack of remorse. The timing, content, and context were sufficient to support a motion for probable cause. A formal request for arrest and indictment followed within 48 hours. William Major was transferred from Green River Correctional Complex to Boone County Jail under sealed order. He was arraigned on June 20th for 1 count of murder in the first degree and 1 count of tampering with physical evidence. Bail was denied. Prosecutors moved quickly to consolidate evidence from both the reopened homicide file and the 1985 abuse conviction. Investigators then returned to the site where the skull had been discovered 20 years earlier. A new excavation was conducted using ground-penetrating radar. The aim was not to recover additional remains. Decomposition and environmental factors had likely destroyed most biological traces, but to locate any artifacts that may have survived. This time, they found 3 metallic objects: a bent zipper pull, a rusted brass snap button, and a corroded clasp. All were consistent with women's clothing manufactured in the late 1970s. The items were cataloged and tested for trace materials, but no usable DNA was present. Meanwhile, prosecutors built the case from multiple angles. They brought in forensic pathologists to testify about the likelihood of intentional burial, the location's proximity to Major's family property, and the absence of Marlene's dental records due to complete loss of teeth post-mortem. Analysts confirmed the likelihood that the skull had been buried and unearthed naturally, which aligned with theories of a shallow grave. They also included Marlene's journal entries from 1980, retrieved from her friend Glenn St. Hilaire. Several passages explicitly referenced fears for her safety, her suspicion that her husband was abusing their son, and her intent to meet with an attorney. Her last noted entry was dated October 10th, 2 days before her disappearance. The handwriting had been authenticated by a forensic document examiner. In the pre-trial hearings, the defense attempted to suppress the prison call, arguing it lacked direct admission of guilt. The judge denied the motion, citing cumulative weight from corroborating evidence. The timeline, journal, physical proximity of remains, William's prior abuse conviction, and the absence of any effort on his part to report Marlene missing, despite knowing she never returned, formed a coherent narrative for prosecution. Detectives also obtained sworn statements from the attorney's office Marlene had contacted prior to her disappearance. A secretary confirmed the appointment for October 13th had been scheduled but never kept. A call log entry recorded Marlene's name on the firm's phone sheet. This further substantiated her documented intent to initiate divorce proceedings, a potential trigger. Lalana, now 25, was placed on the witness list. Her testimony wasn't central to the murder charge, but it reinforced a pattern of intimidation, concealment, and history of abuse. She had been the one to match her mother's profile to the Jane Doe report. She had filed the DNA submission. She had followed the paperwork. By August 2001, the pre-trial discovery process was complete. A total of 47 exhibits were entered into the court docket, including physical artifacts, written documents, forensic analyses, and recordings. No additional eyewitnesses existed, but circumstantial evidence was aligned, consistent, and time-verified. The trial date was set for October 1st. The Commonwealth v. William Major opened on October 1st, 2001, in the Boone County Circuit Court. Jury selection began at 8 a.m. and concluded just after 3 p.m. 12 jurors and 2 alternates were impaneled. All jurors were vetted for prior knowledge of the case, and none had served during the 1985 proceedings. The trial was scheduled for 7 court days with a total of 19 witnesses set to testify. The prosecution's case was built on cumulative evidence. There was no single eyewitness, no confession in the traditional sense, but each item, each artifact, document, testimony formed a continuous, corroborated chain. Opening statements emphasized 3 elements: the last known movements of the victim, the pattern of abuse and coercion within the home, and the incriminating prison phone call recorded 2 decades later. The first 2 days of testimony focused on foundation. Forensic anthropologists explained the condition of the skull and burial site. Experts from the North Carolina DNA lab walked the jury through the process of mitochondrial testing and its reliability in maternal matching. Marlene's daughter, Lalana, testified on day 3. Her appearance was deliberate and brief, focused solely on the identification process and her submission of the DNA sample. Prosecutors did not ask her to speak about the past abuse or the family dynamic, having already entered that information via sealed transcripts from the 1985 conviction. The journal was entered into evidence on day 4. Handwriting authentication had already been pre-admitted. Several excerpts were read aloud, including Marlene's account of preparing to file for divorce and her suspicion of child endangerment. One sentence written in uneven script was noted by the prosecution. "If I go missing, please start here." William Major sat expressionless throughout the testimony. He did not speak. His legal team declined to put him on the stand. On day 5, the prosecution introduced the monitored prison call as a key exhibit. The jury listened to the audio in open court. Forensic audio specialists confirmed its authenticity and chain of custody. The most notable line, "I handled it, it wasn't supposed to go that way," was replayed twice. No objection was sustained. The defense did not present an alternative suspect or theory. Their approach rested on attacking the timeline, suggesting the burial site may not be connected to Major's movements, and that Marlene could have been killed by someone else before being dumped near his family's land. They offered no witnesses to support the claim. Instead, they questioned the reliability of long-delayed forensic methods and the risk of prejudice stemming from Major's prior convictions. On October 9th, closing arguments concluded. The jury entered deliberation at 4:12 p.m. A verdict was returned by 10:17 a.m. the next day. Guilty on both counts, murder in the first degree and tampering with physical evidence. Sentencing was set for November 14th. The prosecution requested life without parole, citing premeditation, concealment, and the pattern of violent abuse toward family members. The judge granted the request. William Major was formally sentenced to life in prison at Kentucky State Penitentiary. The case was considered resolved. However, in March 2005, Major's defense filed a motion to vacate the conviction under Rule 11.42 of the Kentucky Rules of Criminal Procedure. The appeal was based on claims of ineffective assistance of counsel and the argument that the recorded phone call was improperly admitted. The appellate court denied the motion, but the case was then taken up by the Kentucky Supreme Court under procedural review, specifically evaluating whether the defense had sufficient opportunity to challenge the admission of hearsay in the call. In a 4-3 decision issued October 2005, the court ruled that the original conviction was compromised by procedural irregularity during evidentiary presentation. The judgment was vacated. A retrial was ordered. William Major remained in custody throughout. The second trial, held in 2006, largely mirrored the first. All prior exhibits were reintroduced. The difference was structural. The prosecution adjusted the framing of the prison call and bolstered the circumstantial timeline through additional forensic context. This time, the verdict was again guilty, and the sentence remained unchanged. There were no further appeals. William Major was returned to Kentucky State Penitentiary under maximum security classification. According to Department of Corrections records, he never received visitors. No members of his family attended sentencing. He died in custody in 2017. No obituary was published. William Major died in 2017 at Kentucky State Penitentiary. No cause of death was released publicly, but Department of Corrections records confirmed it was non-homicidal and unremarkable. He had served 11 years of his life sentence and had never filed another appeal after the 2006 retrial. His body was unclaimed. According to prison logs, no one visited him during his final years. He was buried in the facility's numbered cemetery. The court-validated conclusion of the case did not bring formal closure for those left behind. For Lalana, the verdict had been necessary, but not redemptive. By the time her father died, she was 41 years old. She had changed her last name years earlier and relocated out of state. Her occupation remained unlisted in public directories, though court records indicate she worked periodically as a trauma-informed peer support advocate. She never gave interviews. Her last public statement on the case was during the second trial's sentencing hearing, where she stated only, "It was never about revenge, It was about knowing I wasn't crazy. Donald, her brother, had disappeared from the public record entirely by the late 1990s. Social services confirmed he had aged out of foster care and left the region. No contact information, known residence, or employment history surfaced in the investigation. One report indicated he may have legally changed his name and moved west. No further details were confirmed. Detectives never re-interviewed him after the original 1985 case. His silence remained intact. The physical location where Marlene's skull had been discovered in 1981 remains undeveloped. The wooded ridge near Hathaway Road is now part of a restricted-use agricultural boundary with no public access. No memorial marker was ever placed. The rest of Marlene's remains were never found. Boone County does not maintain an active cold case division. As of 2023, the sheriff's office lists the Oaks case as closed. No other investigations linked to William Major are pending. No additional victims have come forward. The files remain archived in sealed record storage. But the broader legacy of the case, what it exposed and what it failed to prevent, continues to appear in legal advocacy circles. Marlene Oaks' name is now part of 2 academic studies on systemic delay in domestic violence-related homicide investigations. Her case is cited in at least one law school curriculum module focused on the use of retrospective forensic evidence in cases involving intimate partner violence. Several organizations have quietly used the case to train victim advocates in how to recognize red flags in underreported households, particularly when survivors present written records of fear or risk. One such training document uses an anonymized version of Marlene's journal and the phrase she had handwritten before her disappearance: "If I go missing, please start here." No documentary has been produced, no podcast episode is aired, but the court record exists, and it holds. In the end, the story of Helen Marlene Oaks did not unravel with dramatic confrontation or a final confession. It was solved by persistence, procedural integrity, and a daughter who refused to leave the paperwork alone. It took 21 years, 2 trials, a reclassified body, and a forensic lab that hadn't existed when the crime occurred. What this case reinforces is not just the danger of a single man, but the cost of collective delay. The years when no search was ordered, the evidence that sat in climate-controlled silence, the unanswered questions posed by children, and the time lost between suspicion and verification. Marlene Oaks was not the first woman to write down her fear and be ignored, and she won't be the last. Maybe it's not just about what happened to Marlene Oaks. Maybe it's about what happens when no one listens, when warning signs are seen as exaggerations, when a journal, a bruise, or a missed appointment is just overlooked. If you've ever felt silenced, dismissed, or unseen, this story isn't just a tragedy. It's a reminder your voice matters. If you're watching this and it struck something inside you, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. If you didn't connect with it, that's okay too. Let me know why and where you're watching from. I read every comment, and your perspective helps this channel grow. If this video made you pause, reflect, or feel, don't scroll past. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me for the next story. There's always more beneath the silence.